At a time when we're losing our oldest and most precious trees and forests from around the world, I'm curious to understand if and why this matters to all of us. Welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. I'm Tom Hill, and it's here that I meet with people from all walks of life to explore the answers to one essential question. What do trees mean to you? Tom Joye is an experienced arboricultural trainer and the owner of Dendrocentric Consultancy, which he founded in Belgium in 2020. And he's also a bit of an expert when it comes to the practice of tree architecture, a branch of tree science and insight that relies heavily on direct observations of trees and the innate patterns that plants rely on as they unfold into the world around them. Tree architecture is a hot topic in the arb circles I move in, and I've long wanted to cast some extra light on this alternative way of thinking that Tom shares through his sold-out courses. So let's meet with him to learn a bit more. Hi Tom, welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. I know you're a really busy guy and I'm so grateful for your time today. You're someone that's definitely helped to inspire my tree journey, particularly when it comes to tree architecture. That's a concept that made me look at trees differently, and I thought it'd be great to share some of that thinking with our listeners. But yeah, how are you doing? Where are you today?
I'm good. I'm in Belgium, my home base. This is my garden, so very relaxed.
That's what we like. This podcast aims to provide relaxation and some therapy for the listeners as well. A lot of people I've heard listen to it have said, yeah, they find it relaxing. We need more of that in the world for sure. And I'm grateful for your contribution in that respect. I think we'll dive straight in if that's okay with you.
Perfect.
So, Tom, what do trees mean to you?
Ooh, that's a deep question to start off with. Actually, I must say that it might sound a bit mellow, but trees are my life, basically. They are what I do as a job, and they are what I like besides my job. So that's like a 24/7 passion, I think. They inspire me. They are the center of my life, I could say. Yeah.
Yeah, and how long's that been the case?
I think at the very beginning, being a forester by training, I had a connection with nature and with woodlands and things like that, but maybe not that deep as it is now. So it's something that grew over time. But I must say that at least for the last 10, 15 years, they're really like the thing that really inspire me. So yeah, I think it's still growing, actually. I'm still impressed every day with what they achieve and how they survive and all the tricks that they play. So yeah, that feeling keeps growing.
Yeah, trees definitely keep us guessing, right?
Absolutely. And the second you think that you got it, you finally got it, they do something that really turns that all over and you have to start rethinking the whole thing.
And was it in Belgium that you grew up and kind of learned trees?
Yes, it was here in Belgium. But of course, for my job, I travel a lot of European project work. So I think it's a bit of a combination of being inspired by people here in Belgium, both tree managers and arborists, but then also travel and talk to a lot of people outside of Belgium, because Belgium's very densely populated. We don't have that many trees in the landscape like in the UK or different parts of Europe. So it was really inspiring to open up and to talk to like-minded people in different parts of Europe.
Yeah, so talk to me a little bit more about those differences. So in a place like Belgium, like you said, a heavily populated country, perhaps with more development as a result of that. How are the treescapes different there to somewhere like the UK?
Well, ever since the Middle Ages, Belgium, and especially the northern part, Flanders, where I live, it has been very densely populated. So the woodland cover back then was even lower than it is right now. And I think apart from Ireland, we have the lowest woodland cover in Europe. So it's not something recent. It's something that has been like that for centuries. But something that is pretty recent is that our urban planning is pretty shitty. So since the 60s, we've started building houses and industry factories pretty much everywhere in the landscape. We kind of ruined our landscape, you could say. Traveling through Belgium, you will never get the feeling like this is an urban area and now we're on the countryside and then you have the next urban area. It's all suburbia, you could say. It's all suburban. So that means that the pressure on trees is quite high in the landscape. A lot of industrial agriculture, a lot of industry, a lot of houses scattered around, and then a tree in the middle of that trying to survive. So yeah, Belgium is a tough place for trees to survive. If they can do it here, they can do it anywhere.
Thanks, Tom. That's really interesting. Like, I can actually see how that would have informed your own kind of interest and passion to get things right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we don't have a lack of problems to fix here when it comes to trees. Every now and then you see a tree that's really thriving, but most of the trees have at least some kind of problem trying to survive where they are. So that's really something that pushes me to do better every day, to get more trees into that landscape and more healthy and thriving trees. Yeah.
And I think that really tees us up nicely to chat about the main concept I wanted to discuss today, which is tree architecture.
Yeah.
So this was a concept that came onto my radar just before like the pandemic, actually. And I did some training with you for 2 days to learn about this concept. And it was actually just before the winter. And given that it's about a tree's branching patterns and architecture, I really remember that, driving around for my job or whatever, I could really see the trees in a whole different light. And I'm really grateful for you sort of passing that kind of way of thinking on. But I'm also aware that in this podcast format as well, we don't have the luxury of some of the brilliant diagrams that you shared in that course. So we've got a job to do between us to try and translate some of this thinking purely by word of mouth, actually.
Yeah.
So yeah, any hacks you've got to help our listeners try and grasp some of these concepts would be much appreciated. But I'm going to hand to you to try and just give a little bit of an overview, actually, of what tree architecture is and means, perhaps a little bit about where it's come from. And then after that, we can delve into some of the main terms that you have in that world.
Okay. You're completely right. Tree architecture is a branch of science that is best trained whilst drawing and making diagrams. And so trying to explain it without a pencil is quite hard and quite new for me as well. But I'm going to do my best. So tree architecture is something that came onto my radar maybe something like 15 years ago. And especially in French-speaking parts of Belgium, there was a lot of people that heard of a researcher called Pierre Rambaud. And he's actually the one that made the connection between the science of tree architecture and the arborist world. So he was really a practical guy. And that concept triggered me because I kind of felt that this is something worth exploring. So I dived in a little deeper. And then I found out that apart from the work that Rambaud had done, there was a whole world of tree architecture science that had not been unraveled for us. It was still there. These scientists, they worked in France. But unfortunately, as the French do, they publish in French. And it was hard for somebody that came from outside of France to dive into that world. But being a trainer, I thought it might be interesting to transfer some of these concepts to my students. So I started off by traveling to France myself. Luckily, being a Belgian, we have these two languages as our mother tongue, Dutch and French. And so I could understand these books and the training. And like you say, it really opened up a new world for you. That was exactly the feeling I had when I came back from one of those trainings. It was like my eyes had been opened and you saw things in trees that you've never seen before because nobody ever pointed them out. And once you saw them, you could never unsee them. You saw them everywhere. And that was a feeling that really inspired me and that told me this is something worth pursuing and trying to really get a hold of. So from that onwards, where did it come from? I already talked about it a little bit. One of the founders of tree architecture as a science was a well-known French botanist, Francis Halley. who is still around, delivering a training, who came to the UK this spring, actually, in a conference at Kew. And Francis Halley, together with a Dutch forester, Rolf Olderman, they kind of found each other in the 60s, trying to develop these new ideas. And they, in turn, they were inspired by indigenous people in South America and in Africa, in the tropical rainforest. Because Halley and Alderman, being trained botanists, they were trained in Linnean botany. They were trained to look at flowers in order to identify plants. But in these tropical trees, the flowers were all up there, 40, 50, 60 meters high. So these two very well-trained botanists, they couldn't identify a single tree. And all the indigenous people who never had any training in botany, they could identify a tree from half a mile and saying, well, that's this tree and that's this tree and that's this tree. So these botanists were struck by seeing that these indigenous people, they could recognize all the trees without any training, and they had years of training and they couldn't recognize a single tree. So it sparked them that these indigenous people, they must look at these trees differently. They looked at different things. And of course, they looked at the architecture. They looked at the way that this tree was building its structure. They started exploring that. And actually, for decades or even centuries, scientists had already unraveled small bits and pieces of the architecture of trees. But Halley and Alderman were the first ones to put all these pieces of the puzzle together and to make one overarching theory, you could say, which they published in the early 70s. And I think we could call that the birth of tree architecture as a science. It's all pretty new. Francis Halley is still around, so that's still the first generation of tree architecture scientists.
I've got a quote from him, actually, which you shared in your course, actually, but it's something I wrote down. So it was from Francis Halley, and he said, in order to really understand a complex structure, one has to spend time with it. Taking pictures is something for hurried people. You cannot get to know a tree in a split second. And he speaks about the education of the eye, doesn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of sums it up. He really practices that when he comes to a new place. The thing he always does is just sit down for half an hour and drawing a tree, trying to know it, trying to find out how did this tree get here after these centuries of growing, what happened throughout its life. And what we do as arborists or as consultants is we rush from tree to tree, taking pictures and thinking that we understood everything. But actually what Francis says is you didn't understand anything. It's impossible to understand anything in that split second. So yeah, tree architecture is about the education of the eye and forcing yourself to look, to really look, not just a glance, but really sit down and have an active observation of that tree. Absolutely. That's what it's all about.
And just like kind of architecture in buildings, there are 22 kind of basic kind of blueprints, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying for a second that trees kind of replicate these perfectly every single time. But yeah, perhaps you can explain a little bit more about that. So in a sense, tree architecture, it proposes that in the whole world of all the different tree species, there are actually kind of 22 basic models. Have I got that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's even wider than that. It's all plant species. So it's not just trees, because all plants have architecture. Of course, the plants that are not trees, they are smaller and less complex, and they don't live for so long. So their architecture is quite basic. Every plant has architecture. And that was the revolutionary thing that Halley and Alderman came up with, is that their theory was that there's this very limited number of fixed building plans, and that all plants, after hundreds of millions of years of evolution, actually all converged into this very limited number of fixed architectural models. And what really struck me is that at the time of publication, some of these models that they described were actually still hypothetical. They had never seen a tree or a plant that behaved like that before, but they kind of found it logic that somewhere on this planet there would be a tree or a plant that built its structure, because it made sense. And then, interestingly, in the years after that publication, people sent them pictures from all over the world. Yeah, I've actually found a tree that did what you described. So it's amazing that they came up with that overarching theory, which actually still stands today. Of course, there's always discussion. That's how science works. So a couple of new models have been introduced. So we're now up to 24 models, but these models have been disputed by others. But we're still somewhere in the 22, 24 architectural models. And as you say, another line of dispute you could say is that trees do not replicate this model exactly. It's not, depending on which tree species you look at, they kind of interpret that model slightly differently, but the model still gives you an idea of these are the steps that this tree is going to take to build its structure. Because that's what this architectural model is. It's the building plan, the inbuilt genetic building plan of a plant. So if there would be no influence of the environment, wind and light and soil and pruning and things like that, then this architectural model describes what the tree would want to build by itself. The ideal tree, you could say. So yeah, these models are really the basis of tree architecture as a science.
I'm aware that some of our listeners would never even thought about this concept, and it is quite a big one to get your head around. But as I understand it, it's kind of like thinking about how from a seed and that germination, that kind of process and journey that a plant or tree goes on to unfold into the external environment. So that really comes down to kind of the main stems that it creates and perhaps reinforces. And then the same with the side branching as well, and how it kind of explores the space around it, both above the ground and below it as well. But actually, yeah, there's kind of, tree species that all of us recognize, and sometimes immediately, and particularly when they're out of leaf, if you can identify trees out of leaf, there's something about it, isn't there? There's something about its kind of identity or habit that we do kind of recognize already. And tree architecture helps to explain why we recognize those forms, right?
Absolutely. I think that everybody that has worked with trees, especially if you've worked with trees for quite some time, you know about tree architecture. But it's somewhere there in that gut feeling. Like you say, driving past a tree in the landscape, you're pretty sure, you're pretty confident that this is an oak and that's an ash and that's a beech. You can't really tell why, because it's a combination of habit and branching pattern and stem and bark structures, maybe. All of that combined together makes you confident, yeah, it's that tree species. And tree architecture is about confirming that and giving you more ammunition, you could say, more substantiation to kind of explain why you're confident that this is the tree you're looking at. Because trees, they all have one thing in common, and it's not something that evolved a single time in evolution. It's something that happened many times, but the point of being a tree is that you try to be bigger than your neighbors, then you can be more successful. But in order to do that, they had to build this permanent woody structures, because just leaves were no longer enough. They had to invent wood, you could say, to build these structures and to build that single stem, because that's what we call a tree. It might have 2 or 3 stems, but it doesn't have 10 stems. If it has 10 stems, then it's a shrub. It's no longer a tree. It can be a big shrub, but what we call a tree is a species that by itself, without human intervention, builds that dominant structure that we call a stem. But they do so, different tree species do so in a very different way. And of course, there's trees, I'm going to call them trees, they're not really trees, like palms. So they just grow from one meristem, one bud on top, and they just keep doing that for centuries, building just that stem with leaves on it. And there's trees like that as well, but they're mostly in the tropics and in the subtropics. That's why I use palms as an example. But papaya, for example, people might know the fruit. Well, as a tree, it looks exactly like a palm tree, and it's a real tree. whilst other trees like our oaks, well, they build that stem to begin with, but of course, different than this papaya or this palm tree, they have branches and their stem can duplicate and fork, building that huge canopy, that huge crown that we have. So they're both trees or tree-like plants, but they have a different way of building their permanent structure, you could say. And every plant that's still around, you could say, is a winner of evolution. They have tried and tested this model for hundreds of millions of years. And there's not a single solution to the problem of being a tree on this world. There's different ways of being a tree. And I think these models describe exactly that. Just the different successful solutions to the problem of how can I build this big structure, this big permanent structure to be a successful plant on this planet.
Yeah, and it could be argued that sort of bringing things down to 22 kind of basic models is like reductionist. But personally, I think it only reinforces for me kind of the beauty of nature's expressions and the efficiency. It's a level of efficiency that the greatest engineers of all time and arguably the greatest sculptors and artists can never perfectly kind of replicate. It's something that I think is really to be marveled at. And I love that there's language brought to this amazing kind of timeless unfolding of plants and how they've really nailed survival. Tom, I've got a bit of a fun challenge for you. Okay, so I'm aware there's various kind of terms and stuff to go into. We could super geek out on those and go down deep rabbit holes. And by the way, we'll definitely be coming back to a more freewheeling conversation after this bit. But I'm wondering, right, what if I was to challenge you as someone that normally has your diagrams to kind of explain stuff? Right, imagine, you've got 30 seconds to explain each of these terms. So I'll fire them out there. Imagine it's people that have never heard of these either.
Okay.
See how you get on. And
bring it on.
No pressure. Okay, right. So first one. Okay, so hierarchy. How about that?
Hierarchy. And hierarchy is very important in trees because, as we said earlier, what defines a tree for me is that single structure, that stem in the middle. So hierarchy is all about the rank between pieces of the tree. You have the dominant structure, which is the stem. Then the next in rank are the branches, then the twigs, then the branchlets, then the short shoots. So that's the hierarchy in a tree.
Love that. Well, you nailed that. I think that was even 20 seconds, Well done, Tom. Okay, so versus hierarchy, we also have polyarchy.
Yeah. Okay, so hierarchy might be a word that people can relate to from other sectors. Polyarchy is a word that is pretty new to most people usually, but actually polyarchy is very easily defined as the lack of hierarchy. So if you have two structures that are identical, where there's no rank between them, then that's polyarchy. So a fork in a tree, for example, is polyarchy. And that could be a moment of polyarchy or a permanent state of polyarchy in which something forks and forks and forks and forks and just duplicates.
And then things might look a bit more chaotic to what we might normally consider a tree, I guess.
Absolutely.
The next one then, and it's a word you mentioned a little bit ago, but meristem. So what is a meristem?
A meristem, it's what we could call the stem cells of a plant. So it's the cells that have the capacity to be anything. They can form a root, they can form a branch, they can become wood, they can become bark, they can become a leaf. So the meristems, there's a lot of meristems in plants, but most of them are in buds. So on the apex of every shoot, there's a meristem, and that's where plants actually grow. But also on the root tips, there's meristems. And then there's a very important meristem, which is the cambium, which forms wood and bark. So meristems are basically stem cells, the stem cells of plants, you could say.
Thank you. So the meristems are where all of that great potential lies for response to environment, recovery, and yeah, growth as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know that's where the magic happens. But how does that meristem know what to do? That's a whole different ball game trying to explain that. So we're still just scratching at the surface there. Yeah,
Yeah. I'll come back to you in 20 years on that one, maybe. Yeah.
perfect.
Okay. The next term then, gigantism.
Gigantism. Okay. So gigantism is a strategy that trees adopt to become huge, basically, to become gigantic trees. And the tree that you must have in mind is a sequoia or a sequoia dendron, for example. They are hierarchic when they're young, so they have a very dominant leader. They keep growing in hierarchy for centuries or even millennia, and they become these huge 100-meter plus trees. And then, of course, they're battered by the environment and by hurricanes and by lightning strikes. But what they want to become is a giant tree. So that's gigantism, the strategy of remaining hierarchic throughout your life.
Yeah. And the growth hormones in those must be so active compared to perhaps other trees where they're more in moderation. And I always think it's amazing to consider those huge pillars just sort of full of water as well. A whole column of water suspended in the air, basically.
It's amazing. It's mind-blowing to look at these giant trees. Absolutely.
So versus this strategy of gigantism, like you see in the giant redwoods, how about reiteration? What kind of growth strategy does that represent?
So reiteration is where you get these where trees build their structure by switching between a hierarchic mode and a polyarchic mode. So these giant trees, the redwoods, they remain hierarchic throughout their lives. And then a lot of deciduous trees, like our oaks, after being hierarchic for quite some time when they're young, building their stem, they kind of switch to a growing between hierarchy and polyarchy, meaning that every now and then you get a fork that is formed. And as we said earlier, a fork is like a repetition of the basic structure, and you no longer have hierarchy because they're on the same rank. And then these two limbs, they grow in hierarchy for some time, and then they have polyarchy again, and they have another fork. So that's a strategy of reiteration or duplication. So there's a bit of discussion about the words between scientists. A reiteration is basically a repetition of something, a repetition of a basic building block, a basic structure. That could be a whole tree, that could be a branch, but a reiteration as a concept is just the repetition of a part of a tree.
Great. And I love how you're kind of stacking the concepts as we're going through them. You're kind of recalling the ones you've explained earlier, much like a reiterative strategy, actually. Yeah. So, yeah. So the other one linked to what we were just describing there, I guess, would be an architectural unit.
Okay. And actually, to understand that the architectural unit of a tree species, we need to go back to what you said earlier, is that these architectural models, grasping those hundreds of thousands of species and pushing them all into this very limited number of models, you can feel that there's a bit of nuance getting lost there. It's a reduction. And then next generations of scientists, they started building upon that foundation. So the architectural model is the foundation, but adding that nuance in again, that's when you get this architectural unit. So the architectural unit of a tree species is actually a very detailed and nuanced description of how does this tree species handle that architectural model. And it actually comes down to defining the ranks in your hierarchy. So you say, well, this tree is in this model, the Massart model, to name just one. But then you could say, well, a spruce tree or a beech tree uses that model, and it has 5 ranks. And you describe every single one of those ranks, so the stem and the branches and the twigs and the short shoots. So that the architectural unit is a very detailed description of a tree species. adding the nuance back into the architectural model.
Thanks, Tom. I'm so grateful for the clarity you're able to talk about this with. It's brilliant. And I guess, yeah, just sort of helping some of this to land. Let's just take a moment, I guess, for our listeners to imagine a tree. Think of maybe an archetypal type tree in your mind with no leaves on it. It's the winter, it's the dormant season. And we're going to look at a deciduous tree, so not a tropical tree, because most of my audience will relate to those kinds of trees. But yeah, just as Tom was describing about breaking it down into architectural units, imagine the first unit is that main stem, that upright trunk. And then you've perhaps got 4, 5 big side branches. And then from that, perhaps on each of those, maybe 3, 4, maybe even 7 smaller branches, but we're starting to get smaller in diameter now. So we're kind of tapering down. And then zoom in to just one of those side branches. And again, we're looking at further repetitions of side branching there, getting ever smaller until you get to those minuscule, really skinny twigs with bud stem potentially on the ends of those. And that's what we're talking about here in sort of breaking this down into those units, and there being slight variations between different tree species in how all of that unfolds and what it looks like and what shapes it might take on and what space it might occupy. Because it's as much about the space between each of those growing, living parts of the tree as it is those more solid parts in the time-space continuum, I guess, Tom. Is that right?
No, absolutely. Like I said earlier, the way that this tree builds its structure, it's that tree's solution to the problem of being as efficient as possible in time and in space, like you say. So these ranks, they actually serve the tree to explore space in an efficient way, you could say. If everything would be a stem competing with each other, growing like hell, then that would be very inefficient. So you also need the lower ranks, which are slow growing and which are exploiting space rather than exploring it, in order to be efficient and to get as much sunlight as you can, not outcompete your own branches, and still be strong and stiff in those winds. So yeah, absolutely. The spaces in between structures are as important as the branches themselves, you could say.
Thanks. And yeah, just to say, with the 30-second challenge, I think you totally nailed that one. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. What did I win?
I'll work that out later. So I wonder if you can chat me through a little bit about how in trees of different ages, so not only different tree species, but we see in different age classes of trees, that these ideas express at different rates, and there's a difference between how young and old trees grow. Is that right?
Absolutely. So the architecture definitely changes throughout the life stages of trees. And scientists have started off with describing younger trees because they're easier to understand, they're less complex. But maybe more importantly, they haven't been battered by their environment too much. They're truer to the model, you could say. Whilst if a tree has been around for centuries, well, it must have had dozens of droughts and insect plagues and lightning strikes and storm events and arborists passing by and hacking branches off. So that's one of the reasons that older trees have a different architecture. But even in their development, their behavior, you could say, changes. So when they're young, they're very hierarchic. They have a very dominant leader. And depending on the species, the way that dominance is expressed might be different. But still, when trees are young, they will build that stem and try to become big. Whilst when they're older, especially the broadleaf trees, and not these giant trees, but the broadleaf trees, they start exploring space more rather than growing in height. So they start building this crown. So that switch from pure hierarchy to hierarchy and polyarchy already changes the appearance and the architecture of the tree. But then on top of that, these architectural units, so the repetition that the tree has, they become increasingly smaller as the tree ages. With each fork you get a repetition of the same building block, but you kind of get a smaller version of that basic building block. So then you end up with a mature tree having that huge crown consisting of maybe tens of thousands of identical repetitions of the same architectural unit, but it will all be a very small architectural unit. Nothing like that huge first architectural unit of the young tree. It will be a mini-me version of that first architectural unit. And then on top of that, there's this kind of inbuilt dysfunction, you could say, because as a part of that, the hydraulic resistance in that system also changes. So there's an increase in hydraulic resistance in its vascular system, meaning that this mature tree, it can be very efficient. That's kind of the culmination of what a tree is capable to build. It can be there for a very long time, decades, maybe even centuries, but there will be a point where hydraulic dysfunction kind of hits it. Inbuilt hydraulic dysfunction, nothing linked with the environment. And that's when trees go beyond maturity and have to start reinventing themselves. That's when we start calling them ancient. And we all know that this ancient tree might look very different than the mature tree, but they will all have strategies of often rejuvenation, reinventing themselves, reorganizing themselves in a way that actually repeats something that had been done before. So they kind of overcome maturity by becoming younger again, even though chronologically, of course, they are older. But in that respect, a 500-year-old tree physiologically might be a younger tree than the 300-year-old tree it was 200 years ago. And that's a bit of the mind fuck for us, is trying to understand that, because we have a very linear life. There's no rejuvenation for us. We can just try to avoid the end of our lives as long as possible by living a healthy life, basically. But the tree has the capacity to just rejuvenate. Not all trees and not all tree species, but conceptually, they can do something that we can't, and it's hard for us to understand that. That's something that we struggle with.
Yeah, we project human values and thinking, don't we, onto other organisms.
Absolutely.
And definitely the oldest trees tend to look more like several trees in one. So you'll see younger parts of the tree. In fact, something tree architecture has taught me is to kind of look at the bark. Actually, that can often be quite a good giveaway of where the younger bits of a tree might be. So you might have this really twisted, gnarly old branch that's been there for, maybe more than 100 years. The bark will be all gnarled and kind of, dysfunctional in places, but actually then you've got this almost like a shiny new sapling growing out of the top of it, where a bud has essentially created from the supplies of that older organism a brand new version of itself, almost like offspring. And I just find that super inspiring and exciting in terms of, that sense of resilience and, in the doom and gloom of the environmental issues that we all have to deal with and stuff. It's like there's quite a lot of hope in me that regardless of what happens to our species, trees are going to probably be all right in one way or another.
Absolutely. Yeah. They will outrun us. I'm not worried either.
No, me too. And on the subject of younger trees then, and I suppose in somewhere like Belgium, this must be super accentuated because in redesigning or designing the urban landscape, we have a lot of reliance on bringing new trees into those designs. And then comes the question of where do we get those trees from? And, I work for a huge NGO, and a big part of our focus is around tree planting. It sort of goes hand in hand with the NGO kind of messaging and appeal. And I do think that relationship we have with new trees and ensuring that the next generation come through is so important. But I share with you a bit of a hang up actually on kind of where those trees might come from and actually what kind of, if you like, disservices those trees might have suffered in the early stages of their life. And, globalization and global trade networks of plant movement have probably shaped the practices around how trees are grown and treated when they're younger. But when we're thinking about the architecture of a tree long term, how do some of those treatments play into their long-term futures?
That's a very interesting aspect, one that I really care about as well. In an ideal world, we would be able, in a landscape, to just, if we wanted a tree somewhere, to put a seed in the ground, to water it, and to wait for that tree to grow. And that would be the perfect tree. It would be adapted to the place where it is. It would have grown in its predetermined hierarchic way, building its structure, doing what it can do best. But of course, as the human species, we don't have the patience to do that. And often there's logistics that make it hard to do that. We have kind of subcontracted part of that to the nursery industry, growing trees for us. So putting those seeds in the ground and growing these small trees for us. But like you say, that has increasingly become a global trade thing. So it's no longer the local nursery that grows local seeds and that sells you the 2-year-old trees to plant in your landscape. Now seeds are transported all over the world. And also we want to plant increasingly bigger stock, especially in urban environments. We're no longer happy to have this 2-year-old tree being planted there. No, we want a 6-meter high tree with a stem circumference of 30 centimeters. We want value for money. We want these big trees. But actually being able to deliver that product, being able to transplant it, the nurserymen are forced to intervene. They are forced to cut back roots because it would be impossible to just plant a tree there and after 15 years, let's dig it up and transport it to the other part of the world. That tree would have a huge root system. So they cut the roots. But cutting roots has a huge impact on the organization and on the hormone balance of that tree. And in the aerial part, we also have to prune back those branches and to cut back that leader just to keep it as compact as possible so that we can fit as many as we can on a truck. But all of those things, especially topping the tree and cutting the taproot, they have a huge impact on the organization of the tree, on the way that it can build its structure. So what we basically do is we completely disorganize the tree by doing that. And trees, like we explained earlier, are usually very organized. They have a predetermined way that they want to build their structure, and we kind of shake that all up, disorganizing them. And they have strategies of restoring that. But of course, in the nursery, we don't cut that taproot just once. We cut it 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, even 5 times. And we don't cut that leader back just once. We do it every year. And then we promote the side branch by tying it to some bamboo stick. So we're basically messing with the architecture of the tree. And as a result of that, when we plant that tree in the landscape, what we get is a disorganized tree. It has no clue what it's supposed to do. And that has an impact. It makes it harder for the tree to start growing. Often it just survives for a couple of years rather than starting to build structure. And if they kickstart into growing, they usually do it in a very chaotic way. So we end up with street trees that, they have 5 or 6 stems, and we have a lot of pruning work to do to get them back into shape. Whilst actually, if we wouldn't have mistreated them in the nursery, the tree would do that all by itself. It would have a single stem and grow in a very hierarchic way, in a very efficient way. So yeah, the way that we treat trees in nursery, that's the compromise between having a product that we can drag around the world and the impact on the tree, but actually the logistics far outweighing what we do with the trees. We have kind of lost the tree somewhere along that way. And I think it's very necessary that we take some steps back. And one of the major things is to start planting smaller trees again in our landscape. And I don't think nurseries are going to be happy with me spreading that message, but actually what we want is smaller trees, not bigger trees. It's a bit of a hard tackle maybe, but the longer a tree spends in nursery, the more disorganized it is. So the shorter we can have it in that nursery, the better the tree that's going to get out of that.
It feels like a bit of a blind spot in the industry, this, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And for me, it really is about thinking about how trees have evolved again. And there aren't many natural circumstances where the taproot would be cut off again and again. And so of all the amazing ways that trees have learned to survive, there are a few things like that where why would they ever have needed to be able to do that, you know?
And they're able to do it if you cut the taproot just once. They're perfectly able to fix that. But do it 5 times, well, that's a lot harder.
Yeah.
So we're kind of stretching the capabilities of the tree to respond to its environment, and we're stretching them to the maximum. And it's starting to impact the end result that we get.
Yeah, and particularly when you think about where a lot of these trees are planted, where the soil biome is already compromised and not in optimal condition, they have to work doubly hard to just be a tree, I guess. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Can you explain a little bit about what the current understanding is of tree architecture below ground? So it's much more difficult to study root architecture below ground, isn't it? But are there basic models you could briefly chat us through that you see in the same way above ground?
So, like you say, it's just so hard to study roots because you have to dig the plant up. And I think that's the main reason why there's a lot of science on the architecture of the above ground part and very little on the below ground part. But at least we have some information about that below ground part. And that's especially a French researcher called Claire Adjé. She has researched this a lot. And she sees models and hierarchy as well in the below ground part of the tree. Like that taproot, for example, that's the dominant structure in the root system of that young tree, which is the equivalent to that dominant leader above ground. And then you have, the side roots that are the equivalent to the branches, you could say, and so on. But the thing is that the soil, that environment is so much more limiting and forcing the tree to grow in a particular way that the expression of that inbuilt model, it's less clear below ground. So above ground, it's thin air. The tree can grow wherever it wants. But below ground, you can have hard pans and compacted soil and rocks and a foundation and I don't know what else, guiding a tree to grow in a particular way, making it harder to see the expression of that model. But there's definitely also, you could say, models of root architecture. It's just harder to see them. The tree cannot do what it wants below ground. It must follow what the soil dictates, whilst above ground, it's a lot easier for that tree to express itself. Yeah.
Okay, well, going by how well you did on the last game and challenge I set you, if your energy's still okay, I've just thought of another one, okay? And I think this time I'm going to have to definitely think of a prize, right? And I wondered if your prize might be that you're going to be doing double the amount of tree architecture courses next year off the back of this podcast.
Okay, I'm in. That's delivering training is a treat for me, so no problem.
All right, we can review as it goes along. All right, try this out. So I've got this idea that I think, the way you see trees, I think is just really fascinating. And I think people will really respond to what they've heard today. And I wondered if you could perhaps combine 2 things. So one would be a really cool tree that's like astounded you in the last year or something like that. Okay. I wonder, could you take us to a walk just leading up to that tree. How are you experiencing that thing? And like, feel free to close your eyes to be able to imagine that. But yeah, where are you going to take us? And are you up for giving this a go?
Okay, yeah, I definitely want to give it a go. I'm just thinking, I saw so many great trees in the last year, so I'm just thinking about which one I can pick. Um, Being a bit chauvinist, I'm going to pick a Belgian tree, of course. I'm going to pick the biggest oak that we have here in Belgium, which is the Gros Chêne de Liernu, which actually means the fat oak of Liernu, a small town in the southern part of Belgium. So if you want to get to this tree, where I come from, I have to drive past Brussels first. So that's just that usual hellish situation on the Brussels ring road that I have to get through first. And then when I get past Brussels, I get onto the quieter motorways into the south of Belgium, going off the motorway onto quieter countryside roads. And then all of a sudden you end up in this very small village with a small church in the middle of it. I think it maybe has 50 houses, maybe something like that, stepping back into time. And then when you drive around that church, you just get struck by this huge 10-meter circumference oak tree that is standing just next to that church. And that probably predates that church by many centuries. So it's just no slow seeing the tree in the distance. It's there all of a sudden in all its hugeness. But it's standing there in its very confined space between the roads and that church and the cemetery wall on a small patch of grassland there. And you can see that it's suffered a lot. So there's quite some dysfunction and dead branches, but there's a lot of epicormic shoots and young growth as well. So the tree is showing us I've been around for maybe a millennium even, and I have the potential to go on further, but just stop intervening too much, especially in my routing area. So that's really an amazing tree. I keep being surprised every time I go there when I see it. It has changed, but it's so vigorous. There's so much live growth in it that it will outlive me and it will outlive a lot of the next generations. Yeah, if we don't mess it up, because we're capable of doing that, unfortunately.
Love that. And I guess every time you visit, you come with new insights from your travels and you see the tree in a slightly different way. And almost circling right back to the beginning of our chat, one thing I didn't ask you about was kind of your family kind of roots with trees. So trees like that one, that oak tree, for example, is that something you would have seen as a kid? Or yeah, do you have kind of particular family members in your life that have helped to nurture this appreciation that you still have?
Actually, the short answer to that is no. And that makes it even more surprising, I think, because no, I was brought up with a respect and a love for nature in general, but not particularly for trees. My mother is a psychologist and my dad a truck driver, so we were not really into trees or woodlands or anything like that, or even nature conservation in specific. So it was really a bit of a coincidence. That's how life goes, I guess. And even when going to university, I remember that I was doubting if I would be a structural engineer building bridges and apartment buildings. And actually, the thing that put me onto forestry engineering is that I had to do an entrance exam to become a structural engineer, and I didn't want that. So that's another coincidence. If we didn't have that entrance exam to get into that structural engineering study, maybe I would be designing buildings right now rather than delivering tree architecture training. And when I look at that from where I am now, I think I would be very unhappy. But maybe that would not be the case because I wouldn't have known about this whole world of trees out there. So, yeah, a lot of our life and where we end up with is just one coincidence after another, I think. I was certainly not raised into the tree business, you could say. Yeah.
Yeah, just like a tree, you forked off into a different direction, eh?
just exploring and exploiting space and seeing where that gets us. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for this chat. And I've got a great respect for the work and the advocacy that you're doing. I really look forward to the next time we meet in person. I'm sure it will happen in the next couple of years.
Yeah.
And yeah, just really grateful for the inspiration that this talk will have given to people listening. I hope you have a good day. And I'm going to hand over to you now for a final message for our listeners.
All right, the final message. Famous last words. I think I can just repeat Francis Halle's words, which are, if you really want to understand trees, just take time. It's not time that you have wasted if you have been standing in front of a tree, looking at it for half an hour, trying to get hold of it. The trees will give something back. They will give you back a deeper understanding of what they're capable of doing. And in that way, they will earn your respect. I'm pretty confident that you will be surprised of everything that happens if you just stand in front of a tree and observe it for half an hour. So look at trees and spend time with them. That's the best advice I can give you.
You've been listening to the Meaning of Trees podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, share, leave a comment and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And see you next time.